The lake did not look like water from that height. It looked like a vast sheet of obsidian, cold and absolute, absorbing the gray winter light of Chicago until there was nothing left but a heavy, reflective darkness. Wesley Foster stood by the triple pane glass that rose 12 feet from the floor of his Lakeshore Drive penthouse, a tumbler of water in his hand, watching the snow descend in silent, diagonal streaks. The glass was so thick it muted the roar of the city below, turning the rush of evening traffic on the outer drive into a ghostly, rhythmic hum that vibrated slightly through the soles of his Italian leather slippers. At 42, Wesley was the president and chief executive officer of Foster Meridian Properties, a private real estate investment trust that held over 14,000 residential units across 6 major American cities, a portfolio conservatively valued at $2.6 billion. His office was a temple of minimalist efficiency. His home was even more so. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a newly completed steel and glass tower, a structure that rose above the shoreline like a monument to modern ambition. The kitchen featured monolithic slabs of Calacatta marble that had been imported from a quarry near Carrara, stone that remained pristine and cold, because it had never been subjected to the messy reality of a home-cooked meal. His wine cellar, tucked behind a climate-controlled glass wall in the hallway, held 230 bottles of rare vintages, each one selected by a master sommelier whom Wesley had met exactly once at a charity auction and whose recommendations he had blindly approved. The dining table was a single, long piece of reclaimed white oak, large enough to seat 14 guests comfortably. In the 4 years since Wesley had moved into the apartment following his divorce, not once had every chair been filled. On most nights, only one was. He did not think of himself as a lonely man. In his world, silence was not a void. It was an asset, a premium commodity purchased at a high price to keep the chaos of the city at bay. He was a man who lived by the metrics of spreadsheets, quarterly reports, net operating income, and occupancy percentages. To him, the 14,000 apartments his company owned were not places where people slept, cooked, cried, or raised children. They were performing assets, economic engines that either produced the expected yield or required optimization. He had never stood in the hallway of one of his buildings in Philadelphia or Dallas, never felt the draft from a poorly sealed window in a studio apartment in Atlanta, and never looked a tenant in the eye to ask if the water ran hot in the mornings. He did not need to. He had built a system, a complex, multi-layered machine of regional directors, third-party property management firms, automated software systems, and legal departments designed to ensure that the relationship between landlord and tenant remained entirely transactional, entirely digital, and entirely silent. If a tenant cannot pay their rent, it is the result of a series of personal decisions. Wesley had told his board of directors during the annual portfolio review in December, his voice cool and even, his hands resting flat on the mahogany conference table. It is not our responsibility to solve the systemic, socioeconomic issues of the cities we operate in. Our responsibility is to our investors, to the preservation of our capital, and to the maintenance of our margins. The moment we begin to treat leases as relationships rather than contracts, we compromise the integrity of the entire portfolio. He believed this. He had to believe it because his father had believed it first, and his father had built the foundation upon which Wesley's entire life was constructed. Aldridge Foster had been a legend in Chicago real estate, a man who had started with a single, drafty walk-up in Englewood in the late 1960s and had built a small empire through a sheer, relentless force of will. Aldridge had been a hard man, shaped by the Great Depression and the unforgiving reality of the city's early development. He had taught Wesley that there was no room for sentiment in business, that the second you let a tenant's personal tragedy affect your cash flow, you were no longer a businessman, you were a philanthropist, and philanthropists eventually ran out of money. Pity is a luxury for people who don't have mortgages to pay, son, Aldridge had told him when Wesley was still a teenager, his voice raspy from decades of unfiltered cigarettes, his eyes fixed on the ledger sheets spread across his desk. A lease is a promise written in ink. If they break their promise, they break the lease. It's that simple. You don't owe them a home. You owe yourself a profit. Wesley had carried those words with him like a scripture for 2 decades. They had guided him through the acquisitions of the early 2000s, the restructuring of the company after the financial crisis of 2008, and the rapid, aggressive expansion that had followed his father's death 7 years ago. He had done exactly what was expected of him. He had taken his father's 3,000 units and turned them into 14,000. He had increased the company's valuation by 300%. He had secured his place on the Forbes list of the wealthiest real estate developers in the Midwest. Yet, as he sat at the long white oak table on that cold February evening eating a perfectly portioned meal of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables prepared by a personal chef who had departed hours earlier, the silence in the penthouse felt heavier than usual. Across the room, the television was turned to Channel 7 News, the sound muted, the moving images casting pale blue reflections across the dark marble floor. Wesley wasn't watching. His eyes were fixed on his phone, scrolling through the latest construction reports from a new development project in Denver. He ate mechanically, his mind occupied by zoning disputes, interest rate projections, and tax-deferred EXC hangs. He had built a life that was perfectly insulated, perfectly optimized, and completely empty. There had been a time, briefly, when the empty chairs at that table had bothered him. In the first winter after the divorce, Claire had still left things behind. A silk scarf on a closet hook, a half-read novel on the nightstand, a bottle of perfume that made the bedroom smell like someone else's life. He had boxed them, all within a week, and sent them to her attorney's office with a typed note that said only, "Please confirm receipt." He told himself efficiency was a form of mercy. Claire had told the mediator something different. She said living with Wesley was like living with a beautifully furnished room that never opened a window. She said he loved the idea of a home more than the people inside it. He had not argued. Arguments required an emotional vocabulary he had never been taught to speak. Instead, he signed the settlement, increased his acquisition budget by 18% the following quarter, and told his assistant to schedule dinner only when it served a purpose. Purpose, in his lexicon, meant investors, attorneys, and regional directors. It never meant company. It never meant warmth. It never meant the soft, inconvenient noise of another human being asking how his day had been. On the far wall of the living room hung a single photograph in a frameless acrylic mount. Aldridge Foster at 60, standing in front of a newly purchased brick building on the south side, his hand resting on Wesley's 12-year-old shoulder. Neither of them was smiling. In the Foster family, photographs were not memories. They were proof of ownership. The memory of the building on 63rd Street always returned to Wesley in the winter when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind off the lake carried the scent of frozen concrete. He had been 14 years old when his father took him there on a Saturday morning in January. The air was so cold that Wesley's breath turned into solid white plumes the instant it left his lips, and the exhaust from the old Buick his father drove hung in the street like a thick, gray fog. The building was a 3-story brick walk-up, its facade covered in soot, its windows dark and uninviting. They walked through the front entrance, past a mailbox unit that had been pried open and never repaired, and into a hallway that smelled of damp wool, fried onions, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap disinfectant. "Watch the stairs, Wesley," his father had said, his heavy leather boots making a loud, hollow thud on the wooden steps. "The treads are worn. I've told the super to fix them twice, but he's too busy drinking to do his job." The railing wobbled under Wesley's hand as they climbed to the second floor. On the landing, 2 men in gray work uniforms were carrying a worn, stained mattress out of an apartment. Behind them stood a woman, no older than Wesley's mother would have been holding a toddler on her hip. She wore a faded winter coat that was missing its top button, her collar pulled tight against the draft that whistled through the hallway window. Two older children, a boy and a girl near Wesley's age, sat on large black plastic garbage bags that had been stuffed with clothes and bedding. The woman was crying, but it was a quiet, exhausted kind of weeping, the sound of someone who had already spent all her anger and had nothing left but a dull, heavy grief. Wesley had stopped on the stairs, his hand freezing on the wobbly railing. "Dad," he had whispered, his voice small in the cold, echoing stairwell. "Can't we help them? Can't we give them more time?" Aldridge Foster had stopped, but he didn't look at the woman or the children. He looked at Wesley, his face expressionless, his hand coming down heavily on his son's shoulder. "You feel sorry for them, Wesley?" his father had asked, his voice flat, completely devoid of anger or sympathy. "Good. That means you're human. Now, learn to stop. Pity doesn't pay the property taxes on this building. It doesn't pay the water bill or the oil delivery. She hasn't paid her rent in 3 months. If I let her stay, I'm taking money out of your college fund to pay for her housing. Is that what you want?" Wesley had looked back over his shoulder. The toddler on the woman's hip was chewing on the plastic zipper of his coat, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyes wide and curious as he watched the men carry his bed down the stairs. The woman's eyes had met Wesley's for half a second, a look of such profound, hopeless shame that it made him feel as if he had committed a crime simply by standing there in his warm, goose-down jacket. "Come on," his father had said, his grip tightening on Wesley's shoulder, pulling him up the remaining steps. "We have 3 more buildings to check before lunch." That moment had not haunted Wesley. That was the tragedy of it. Over the years, he had let the memory of 63rd Street do exactly what his father had intended. It had taught him to separate his emotions from his balance sheets. There was another lesson that day, one his father never named out loud. In the car afterward, Aldridge had opened a spiral notebook and written 3 lines in his hard, slanted script. "Unit 2B vacated. Unit cleaned. Unit released at market." Then he closed the notebook and turned on the radio as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Wesley understood then that in his father's world, a family could disappear between one entry and the next, and the ledger would still balance. By the time he took over the company, he had mastered the art of distance. He had replaced the old personal property managers with large corporate firms that used algorithms to determine rent increases and automated legal systems to handle evictions. He had turned the business of housing people into a sterile, frictionless transaction that occurred on servers in Virginia and Delaware, far away from his office on Lakeshore Drive. When his father died of a sudden, massive stroke 7 years ago, Wesley did not slow the business down to grieve. He accelerated. He acquired properties in Atlanta, Dallas, and Philadelphia, cashing in on the rising rents of revitalized urban neighborhoods. He contracted Pinnacle Property Group to manage his East Coast holdings, signing a 80-page management agreement in his Chicago office without ever visiting a single one of the 47 buildings they operated on his behalf in Pennsylvania. He didn't need to see them. The reports were delivered to his inbox on the 1st of every month, clean, green, and on time. The system worked perfectly, exactly as he had designed it, until the news segment forced him to look. The salmon had grown cold on his plate. Wesley sat at the long white oak table, his phone in his left hand, his fork in his right, his eyes tracing the lines of a zoning report for a new project in Atlanta. On the television across the room, the local news anchor was speaking, in that familiar, polished, yet urgent tone that television stations used to hold attention before a commercial break. The sound was muted, but the ticker at the bottom of the screen caught Wesley's attention. Breaking: eviction crisis in North Philadelphia. Families left on sidewalk in sub-zero temperatures. He almost went back to his phone. It was a common story, a sad but inevitable byproduct of winter in any major city, the kind of structural reality that his father had taught him to accept as part of the price of progress. But then the camera cut to a live feed, and Wesley's hand froze over his plate. The screen showed a street corner in North Philadelphia. The sidewalk was covered in a thin, dirty crust of frozen snow, the exhaust from passing city. Buses rising in thick, white clouds under the streetlights. Standing on the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around two small children, was a woman in her mid-30s. She wore a thin, gray wool jacket that looked entirely inadequate for the 20-degree weather, her hands bare, her cheeks raw and red from the wind. Behind her, piled on the concrete like a heap of discarded gubra, was everything she owned. A queen-size mattress leaning against a rusted fire hydrant, several black plastic trash bags that had split open to reveal children's clothes and stuffed animals, a plastic laundry basket filled with mismatched kitchen pots, and a box of cereal that had spilled onto the dirty ice. A little girl, perhaps 9 years old, stood next to her mother, a bright pink school backpack still strapped to her shoulders. She was holding the straps of the pack with both hands, her head down, her small body shivering violently in the wind. A younger boy, no older than 5, sat on one of the trash bags, his legs dangling, looking around with a calm, vacant curiosity that was more devastating than tears. The reporter's voice came through as Wesley unmuted the screen. Yolanda Jefferson, a 34-year-old certified nursing assistant, stood on the sidewalk outside her home this afternoon, surrounded by her family's belongings. Jefferson, who has lived in the building for nearly 5 years, was evicted this morning after falling 2 months behind on her rent. She lost her job at a local community hospital 4 months ago due to budget cuts. She tells our reporters she reached out to her property management company 11 times to request a payment plan, but her calls were never returned. The camera panned up, leaving the family on the sidewalk and focusing on the facade of the building behind them. It was a 5-story brick structure, its windows dark, its metal fire escapes rusted and twisted like old wire. Above the arched stone entrance, carved into the granite lintel, was the address, 1847 Kensington Avenue. Wesley's fork slipped from his fingers, hitting the porcelain plate with a sharp, metallic clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. He walked toward the television, his eyes fixed on the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, suffocating force. He knew that address. He opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys as he logged into the master property database. He didn't use the search filters. He typed the numbers directly into the command line. 1847 Kensington Avenue, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The screen loaded, displaying a high-resolution aerial photograph of the building, followed by a list of 48 units, their monthly rents, their occupancy statuses, and their financial performance. He scrolled down to Unit 312. Tenant, Yolanda Jefferson. Lease start, March 15, 2019. Monthly rent, $1,150. Asterisk payment history, 58 months active. 58 months paid on time in full. Asterisk November, unpaid, $1,150. December, unpaid, $1,150. Eviction filed, January 14, 2026. Eviction executed, February 3, 2026. Wesley stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, his breathing shallow and fast. 58 months of perfect payment history. Nearly 5 years of being a model tenant, paying on time, keeping her lease, maintaining her unit. And then she lost her job. She fell behind for 60 days. And his system, the efficient, automated, optimized machine he had spent 20 years perfecting, had filed the paperwork, processed the fees, hired the marshals, and thrown her and her children onto a frozen sidewalk in North Philadelphia. "Are we camping, Mama?" The voice belonged to the little boy, Darnell, his words picked up by the reporter's microphone as he looked up at his mother from his seat on the trash bag. His mother, Yolanda, didn't answer. She just pulled his hood over his ears, her bare hands trembling, her face completely still as she looked into the camera. Wesley dropped his head into his hands, the silence of his penthouse suddenly pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. He had spent his entire life building an empire designed to ensure he never had to see the faces of the people who paid his rent. He had cased his conscience in contracts and management agreements, cashing the checks while Pinnacle Property Group handled the dirty work. But as he looked at the black screen of his television, he knew he couldn't turn the channel. He couldn't scroll past this on his phone. Yolanda Jefferson wasn't a line item on a spreadsheet anymore. She was a woman, standing in the cold outside a building with his name on the deed, her son, asking if they were camping because his mother was too proud to let him see her. Break. He called Derek Langston at 11:47 that night. Derek answered on the second ring, the sound of a restaurant in the background. Silverware, low jazz, the polite laughter of people who never worried about heat. Wesley? Everything all right? Pull every eviction filed under Foster Meridian in the last 12 months. Wesley said. Philadelphia first. Full tenant histories, payment records, contact logs. Everything Pinnacle claims they documented. There was a pause. That's a lot of paper for this hour. Then start now. What's going on? Wesley looked at the dark television, at the faint afterimage of a pink backpack, and a spilled box of cereal. I just watched one of our tenants ask her mother if they were camping on Kensington Avenue in February, in 18-degree weather. Derek exhaled slowly. Wes, these things happen. You know that. The winter cycle. Book me on the first flight to Philadelphia tomorrow morning, Wesley said. And Derek? Do not call Gary Whitmore. I want to see the building before anyone has time to clean a hallway or invent a story. The flight to Philadelphia was a 90-minute blur of gray clouds and freezing rain. Wesley sat in the first-class cabin of the morning shuttle, his laptop open on the tray table, but he wasn't looking at the acquisition files for the new project in Denver. He was staring at a copy of the property management agreement between Foster Meridian Properties and Pinnacle Property Group. The contract was 84 pages of dense, single-spaced legal prose, drafted by his own legal team and signed by his own hand 3 years ago. It was a masterpiece of corpo rate risk mitigation, a document designed to ensure that Pinnacle had maximum operational flexibility while Foster Meridian maintained complete legal distance from the day-to-day management of the buildings. It specified the occupancy targets, the maintenance schedules, the insurance requirements, and the eviction timelines. Section 14.2, Default and Termination, Wesley read, his finger tracing the words on the screen. In the event of a tenant's failure to pay monthly rent, within five days of the due date, manager shall immediately assess a late fee of $75. If the default continues for 30 days, manager shall, without further notice to the tenant, initiate legal proceedings for eviction in accordance with local municipal ordinances. No exceptions shall be made without prior written authorization from the owner. No exceptions. It was a clean sentence, written in the elegant, unfeeling language of corporate law. It had made perfect sense to him when he signed it in his quiet office on Lakeshore Drive. It was efficient. It was predictable. It protected the cash flow. It ensured that the managers in Philadelphia didn't waste time on negotiations or payment plans, that they kept the units turning over, keeping the occupancy rate at the 96% target his investors demanded. But as the plane descended through the gray fog over the Delaware River, Wesley looked at the numbers again. If a tenant missed 1 month's rent of $1,150, the system automatically added a $75 late fee. If they didn't pay by the 15th, another fee was assessed. By the time 30 days had passed, they didn't owe $1,150. They owed $1,350. By the time the eviction was filed, court costs and administrative fees were added to the ledger, pushing the total past $1,800. A woman who had lost her job at a hospital, a woman who had worked for 5 Years for $14.60 an hour didn't stand a chance of climbing out of a hole that deep, that fast. The cyst wasn't designed to help her catch up. It was designed to make her default permanent. It was a conveyor belt that moved in one direction, from the first late payment directly to the sidewalk, and he had built the engine that ran it. He closed the laptop as the plane touched down on the runway, the tires throwing up a high spray of dirty water against the gray concrete. He didn't have his driver with him. He had taken a regular cab from the airport, a dented yellow sedan that smelled of pine air freshener and old cigarette smoke. He gave the driver the address on Kensington Avenue. "You sure you want to go there, buddy?" the driver asked, looking at Wesley in the rearview mirror, his eyes taking in the expensive wool coat and the leather briefcase. "That's not exactly the tourist part of town." "I'm sure," Wesley said, his voice flat. He watched the city slide past the window, the historic brick townhomes of Center City giving way to the industrial remains of North Philadelphia. The vacant factories, the empty lots overgrown with weeds, the overhead concrete tracks of the Market Frankfurt line rising above the street like a rusted spine. This was the city his father had never wanted him to see, the one that lay beneath the surface of his real estate portfolio, the one where his 14,000 doors actually existed. In the back seat, Wesley opened the contact log Derek had emailed overnight. 11 calls from Yolanda Jefferson, 6 voicemails, 3 emails, 1 in person. Visit to the Market Street office on December 5th. Every entry was marked the same way in Pinnacle's internal software. Closed, no action required /policy. Default path active. No human note. No callback scheduled. No flag for hardship. Just a machine, quietly converting a nursing assistant into a case number. The cab stopped 2 blocks from the building. "I'll wait for you here, pal," the driver said, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the street. "But I'm keeping the engine running." "Don't wait," Wesley said. He handed the man a $100 bill, stepped out of the car, and closed the door behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The temperature was 18 degrees. The wind whistling down Kensington Avenue, carrying the scent of diesel exhaust, old garbage, and frozen dirt. Wesley pulled his collar up, but his leather shoes offered no protection against the cold of the pavement. He began to walk. The neighborhood was a landscape of survival. The storefronts were mostly boarded up, their metal security gates covered in graffiti and rust. A corner bodega had a handwritten sign in the window, "We accept EBT." A liquor store with 3-inch thick bulletproof glass had a line of 3 men waiting outside in the cold, their shoulders hunched, their hands shoved deep into their pockets. A young man in an oversized winter jacket stood near a subway pillar, his eyes tracking Wesley's movement with a quiet, dangerous curiosity before he turned back to watch the street. Wesley reached 1847 Kensington Avenue. The building was a 5-story brick block, built in the early 1900s, as a tenement for factory workers, now housing 48 families who had nowhere else to go. The front entrance was propped open with a broken brick, the glass in the door cracked and taped over with duct tape. Wesley stepped inside. The warmth of the hallway was relative, maybe 45 degrees, the air thick and stagnant. It smelled of cabbage, old carpet, damp plaster, and the faint, sweet scent of gas. He walked down the narrow corridor, his shoes squeaking on the dirty linoleum. The walls were painted a sickly green that had peeled away in long, vertical strips to reveal the gray plaster beneath. He knocked on the door of Unit 102. A chain rattled. The door opened 3 inches, held by a brass security chain. Woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything looked out at him. "We don't need whatever you're selling, mister," she said, her voice dry. "I'm not selling anything," Wesley said, his voice sounding hollow in the drafty hallway. "My name is Wesley. I work with the company that owns this building. I'm trying to find out about the conditions here." The woman studied him for a moment, her eyes moving from his wool coat to his clean-shaven face. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Ownership? You're about 12 years late, honey. The radiator in my living room has been clanking like a dying steam engine since November, and the super says he can't fix it because he doesn't have the parts. Come on in if you want to freeze with me. Her name was Odessa Harmon. She was 71 years old and had lived in Unit 102 for 12 years, since before Wesley's company had acquired the building. Her apartment was clean but desperately cold, a small space heater humming in the corner of her living room, its orange coils glowing like a small, trapped fire. The heat went out completely on Tuesday, Odessa said, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot water to keep them warm. Pinnacle says they're working on it. They always say they're working on it, but they never show up until you're 2 days late on rent. Then they're on your porch before the sun's up. Wesley looked at the ceiling. A dark water stain ran from the corner of the wall, spreading outward like a brown map of some forgotten country. Did you know Yolanda Jefferson? He asked. Odessa's face changed. The sharpness in her eyes softened, replaced by a quiet, protective anger. Yolanda? Of course I knew her. She lived right above me in 312. That girl worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, then came home and scrubbed this hallway because she couldn't stand the smell of the trash the super left on the stairs. She used to bring me soup on her day off. Her kids, Xia and Darnell, they're the sweetest things in this building. She leaned forward, her finger tapping the table. They threw her out on Monday, Wesley, in the snow. I tried to keep her stuff in my hallway, but the marshal said if I blocked the exit, he'd file against me, too. They put those babies on the curb like they were old couches. Is that how your company does business? Wesley didn't answer. He looked at his own hands, clean and smooth, and felt a sudden, deep shame that made it difficult to breathe. Before he left, Odessa pressed a folded piece of paper into his palm. On it, in careful blue ink, was an address: Grace Covenant Church, Broad Street. Shelter. Intake after 6. Ask for Pastor Ree. She won't ask you for anything, Odessa said. That's how you know she's hurting. Proud people don't beg. They just disappear. On the 3rd floor, Wesley found the door to Unit 312 still sealed with a strip of orange tape and a printed notice from the Philadelphia Municipal Court. The tape fluttered in the hallway draft like a cheap flag of conquest. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, he could see a rectangle of afternoon light on an empty floor. No furniture, no toys, no life, just the pale outline where a rug had once been, and a single pink hair clip someone had missed when they cleared the unit. He crouched, picked up the clip, and put it in his coat pocket without knowing. It weighed almost nothing. It felt heavier than the keys to his penthouse. The regional headquarters of Pinnacle Property Group occupied the 8th floor of a modern, glass-fronted office building on Market Street, a mile and a half from Kensington Avenue, but a world away in every other sense. The lobby featured sleek leather chairs, a glass water dispenser filled with cucumber slices, and a receptionist who smiled at Wesley with that polished corporate warmth he knew so well. He didn't have an appointment. Mr. Foster, what an unexpected honor, Gary Whitmore said, rushing out of his corner office with his hand extended. Gary was the regional vice president for Pinnacle, a man in his mid-50s with a golf course tan and an expensive suit that looked like a replica of Wesley's. If I had known you were coming, I would have prepared a full presentation on the 3rd quarter optimization results. I don't need a presentation, Gary, Wesley said, walking past him into the conference room. I want to see the eviction files for 1847 Kensington Avenue, specifically Unit 312. Yolanda Jefferson. Gary's smile didn't disappear, but it went rigid at the corners, his eyes darting to his assistant who was standing in the doorway. Of course. Let me have Sarah pull the file. It's a standard non-payment case, Mr. Foster. Nothing out of the ordinary. Pull the file, Wesley repeated. They sat in the conference room under the bright fluorescent lights. A glass table, 12 leather chairs, a flat screen on the wall displaying the Foster Meridian logo. Sarah returned within 3 minutes, placing a thin manila folder on the table. Between them, Wesley opened it. Yolanda Jefferson. Total delinquency, $2,300. Late fees, $450. Legal fees, $350. Total judgment, $3,100. She called your office 11 times in November and December, Wesley said, his voice quiet, his eyes on the payment ledger. She left 6 voicemails. She sent 3 emails. She came into this office on December 5th and sat in your lobby for 2 hours. Why wasn't her account flagged for a payment plan? Gary cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Mr. Foster, we manage over 800 units for your portfolio in this district. If we made individual exceptions for every tenant who faced a temporary financial hardship, we would never meet the occupancy and revenue targets specified in our contract. Your CO, Derek Langston, is very clear about the goals. We maintain a 96% occupancy rate and keep delinquency below 1.5%. She paid her rent on time for 58 months. Gary, Wesley said, his voice rising just a fraction, a low, dangerous vibration. Nearly 5 years. She lost her job because of hospital budget cuts. She wasn't a risk. She was a model tenant. The algorithm doesn't track work history, Mr. Foster, Gary said, his voice cool, professional, completely reasonable. It track KS payments. When a tenant is 30 days delinquent, the system automatically generates an eviction notice. If we don't file, we are in breach of our performance guarantees with your company. We were simply executing the protocols your team designed and approved. The protocols your team designed. The words were a direct hit. Wesley sat back in his chair, looking at the manila folder on the table. Gary was right. Pinnacle wasn't the villain here. They were just the mechanics of the machine he had built. They had followed the instructions to the letter, optimized the returns, protected the margins, and cased the owner from the reality of the consequence. In the United States, landlords file more than 3 million eviction cases every year. In the vast majority of those cases, the tenants do not have legal representation. They walk into housing courts that resemble assembly lines, where judges and lawyers process 50 cases an hour, where leases are treated as absolute, and where the human cost of homelessness is considered outside the scope of the legal proceedings. Eviction is not just an economic transaction. It is a structural industry. Turns over units, allows landlords to reset rents to market rates, and clears out long-term tenants who have become too expensive to maintain. And he, Wesley Foster, was the industry leader. Cancel the contract, Wesley said quietly. Gary blinked. Excuse me? You're terminated. Effective immediately. For all 47 buildings in the Philadelphia region. I'll have my legal team send over the formal notice this afternoon. Gary stood up, his face losing its golf course tan, his hands coming down on the glass table. Mr. Foster, you can't be serious. We've managed your properties for 10 years. We've increased your net operating income by 22%. You put a 5-year-old boy on a sidewalk in the middle of winter because his mother lost her job, Wesley said, standing up and buttoning his coat. And then, you told me you did it because my contract act required it. I'm changing the contract. He walked out of the office, his leather soles silent on the carpet, leaving Gary Whitmore standing alone in a conference room built to celebrate a profit that was suddenly too expensive to bear. In the elevator, Wesley's phone lit up with a text from Derek. Board is already hearing rumors. Vance wants an emergency call. What do I tell them? Wesley typed back. Tell them the truth. We put children on a curb for 2 months of rent. Then tell them I'm not asking for permission. The Grace Covenant Church sat on Broad Street, a massive Gothic structure of gray stone that had been built when the city was young and rich, its spires rising into the gray clouds like stone fingers reaching for mercy. The basement smelled of damp stone, old wool, and the distinct vinegar scent of cheap floor cleaner. Wesley walked down the wooden stairs, his coat left behind in the car. He felt exposed, his white shirt and tailored trousers looking entirely out of place. among the rows of steel cots and folding tables that filled the room. About 40 people were in the shelter, mostly women and small children. They sat on the edges of their cots, their belongings piled in plastic laundry baskets beside them. A television in the corner was playing a cartoon with the sound turned down low, the flickering light reflecting in the eyes of 3 children who sat on the floor watching in silence. Pastor Ree met him near the stairs, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes, and the careful patience of someone who had spent decades watching systems fail. The same families twice. "You're the owner," the pastor said. It was not a question. "I am." "Then you should know something before you talk to her. She doesn't need a speech. She needs heat, a door that locks, and the dignity of not being treated like a problem to be solved on camera. If you're here for your conscience, go home. If you're here for her children, stay." Wesley nodded. "I'm here for her children." He found Yolanda Jefferson in the far corner, near a heating vent that clanked. Every few minutes, she was sitting on the edge of a cot, her back straight, her hands occupied with a small, worn sewing kit. She was mending the zipper on Darnell's winter jacket, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision. Xia was sitting next to her, her pink school backpack on her lap, reading a book she had found in the shelter's small library. Darnell was asleep on the cot behind them, his small thumb tucked into his mouth, his breathing steady and quiet. Wesley approached slowly. He didn't want to startle her, didn't want to look like a threat. "Yolanda," he said quietly. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her stitch, pulled the thread tight, and cut it with her teeth before she raised her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles of exhaustion, but her gaze was steady, cold, and entirely unimpressed. "You're the man from the TV," she said, her voice low, not wanting to wake her son. "My name is Wesley Foster," he said, taking a seat on a folding chair 3 feet away. "I own Foster Meridian Properties." Yolanda let out a short, dry laugh. "I know who you are. I saw your picture on the news last night, the billionaire landlord who wants to help." "I made a mistake, Yolanda," Wesley said. "My company made a mistake. I'm here to fix it." "A mistake?" Yolanda stood up, her hand coming down on the edge of the cot. "You think putting my children on the street is a mistake? You think leaving my daughter to hide crackers in her backpack so her brother would have something to eat is a mistake? That's not a mistake, Mr. Foster. That's your business plan." Wesley looked down at his own hands, his grandfather's silver watch ticking in his pocket. "You're right," he said. "It is the business plan, and it's wrong. I'm here to change it." "I don't need your charity," Yolanda said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "I don't need some rich man showing up with a check and a photographer to make himself feel better before he goes back to his penthouse. I worked 5 years at that hospital. I paid my rent on time 58 times. I didn't ask for a handout. I asked for a phone call." She stepped closer, her finger pointing at his chest. "Your people didn't even have the decency to call me back. They treated me like I was a broken refrigerator they needed to clear out of the room. You want to fix something? Fix that. Fix the fact that your company treats human beings like trash." "I'm terminating the management contract with Pinnacle today," Wesley said, "and I'm prepared to offer you your apartment back. Unit 312. Fully repaired. Rent-free for 6 months with a guaranteed lease at 30% of your income once you find a job." Yolanda studied him. She didn't look happy. She didn't look relieved. She looked suspicious, the way a person looks at a deal that seems too good to be true. Because they've learned that in their world, deals like that always have a hidden cost. "Why?" she asked. "Because I watched your son ask if you were camping," Wesley said, his voice cracking slightly. "And I realized I had built a company designed to ensure I would never have to hear that question." Yolanda looked back at the cot where Darnell was sleeping. She was silent for a long moment, the clanking of the heating vent the only sound between them. Then she turned back to Wesley, her eyes hard and clear. "We'll take the apartment," she said. "But we're not your success story, Mr. Foster, we're just people who need a place to sleep. Don't expect me to thank you for giving me back what you should have never taken in the first place. I don't expect a thank you, Wesley said. I expect to be held accountable. Xia looked up from her book then, studying Wesley with the quiet, precise attention of a child who had already learned to measure adults by what they did after they promised something. Are you the reason we had to leave? She asked. Wesley did not look away. Yes. Xia considered that. Then you should fix the swing. GS2. They broke last year and nobody came. I will, Wesley said, and for the first time in years he meant a promise that would never appear in a quarterly report. That night, Wesley stayed in a mid-range hotel near Center City, the kind of place his assistants never booked because it did not impress anyone. He sat on the edge of the bed with the city glowing through the thin curtains and opened his father's old spiral notebooks, the ones he had kept locked in a vault in Chicago and never intended to read again. Page after page. Vacated, cleaned, released. Names reduced to unit numbers. Human weather reduced to ink. On one page from 1987, Aldridge had written a single personal note in the margin, then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. Woman cried. Children young. Do not record this. Wesley closed the notebook and sat in the dark for a long time. He understood, finally, that his father had not been born without a conscience. He had simply trained himself year by year, entry by entry, to stop listening to it, and Wesley had inherited that training the way other men inherited watches or houses, polished, unquestioned, and lethal. The board of directors meeting of Foster Meridian Properties was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Monday morning in their corporate headquarters on Michigan Avenue. The room was a masterpiece of corporate design. A glass table that sat 18 panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, and a breakfast spread of pastries and fresh fruit that remained untouched because the air in the room was too tense to support an appetite. Derek Langston, the chief operating officer, was pacing near the window, his phone in his hand. Wesley, this is madness, Derek said, turning as Wesley entered the room. You can't just freeze all evictions across the entire portfolio. That's 14,000 doors. The delinquency rate will skyrocket within 30 days. Investors. Our investors will survive, Derek, Wesley said, taking his seat at the head of the table. Our tenants might know. He opened his laptop, connected it to the large screen on the wall, and displayed the eviction report he had pulled in his hotel room in Philadelphia. 847, Wesley said, pointing to the number. That's how many families we put on the street last year. 63% of them were single-parent households. The average tenancy before eviction was over 3 years. These aren't professional deadbeats, Derek. These are people who hit a rough patch and our system refused to listen. It's a business, Wesley. Todd Vance, one of the principal board members, stood up, his hand coming down on the table. We are not a housing authority. We are real estate investment trust. If we start acting like a charity, our valuation will drop by 15% by the end of the fiscal year. The numbers say otherwise, Todd, Wesley said. He clicked a button displaying a new set of data, the results of a pilot mediation program that had been run in Boston by a nonprofit legal aid group. The average cost of an eviction to our company is $4,200, Wesley said, his voice cool, professional, the voice of the CEO, returning. That includes legal fees, court costs, property management labor, unit turnover, paint, carpet cleaning, lost rent during vacancy, and marketing. For a new tenant, if we keep a tenant in their unit through a mediation program or a short-term hardship grant, the average cost to us is $850. Keeping people housed isn't just moral, Todd. It's cheaper. The room went quiet. The board members looked at the screen, then at each other. They were men and women of business. They understood margins. They had been prepared to argue against sentimentality, against guilt, against social justice warriors destroying their returns. But they weren't prepared to argue against math. I'm proposing a complete restructuring of our property management division. Wesley continued, sliding copies of the new corporate charter across the table. We are terminating our contract with Pinnacle Property Group and bringing all management in-house. We are establishing 3 new protocols before any eviction proceeding can be initiated. He pointed to the screen. First, a minimum of 3 in-person contact attempts by a dedicated tenant. Advocate. Not automated letters, not text messages. A human being knocking on the door to find out what happened. Second, a free financial counseling session offered to any tenant who is more than 15 days delinquent. Third, mandatory 30-day review period where the tenant advocate assesses whether the hardship is temporary or permanent. If it's temporary, a layoff, a medical bill, a death in the family, the tenant is automatically approved for our new emergency hardship fund, which will cover up to 90 days of rent. No late fees, no penalties. And where does the funding for this emergency fund come from? Todd asked, his voice skeptical. My personal dividend share for the next 3 years, Wesley said. About $12 million. It's already been transferred to the Foundation's trust account. No one spoke. The board members looked at Wesley, realizing for the first time that this wasn't a debate. This was an executive directive. He had the majority share, he had the voting control, he had the name on the building. He had spent 20 years running the company exactly as his father had taught him, and now he was using that same absolute authority to dismantle his father's legacy piece by piece. There will be pushback, Derek said finally, quieter now. Pinnacle will sue. Some of the pension funds will threaten to sell. The trade press will call this a midlife crisis with a budget. Let them, Wesley said. I'd rather be called foolish for keeping people housed than efficient for putting them outside. The meeting is adjourned, he added, closing his laptop. We begin transition planning with the regional offices tomorrow morning. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were per work, phone calls, resignations, and resistance. 2 regional directors quit rather than rewrite their eviction workflows. Pension advisor flew in from Boston to warn Wesley that soft underwriting on residential risk would spook institutional capital. A trade magazine ran a column titled "Empathy is not a fiduciary strategy." Wesley pinned the article to the whiteboard in the war room and wrote beneath it in black marker. Neither is blindness. He hired 12 tenant advocates in Philadelphia alone, most of them former social workers and housing counselors who had spent years fighting companies exactly like his. On their first day, he told them the truth without polish. You were hired to interrupt the machine I built, he said. If anyone in this company tells you that a family is just a file, send that person to me. At 1847 Kensington Avenue, crews replaced the boiler, resealed the windows, fixed the hallway lights, and rebuilt the playground. Odessa Harmon's radiator stopped clanking. The orange tape came down from Unit 312, then from half a dozen other units that had been sitting empty while families slept on cot 6 blocks away. Not every story ended cleanly. Some tenants had already left the city. Some refused to trust a landlord offering help after the same landlord had destroyed them. Wesley did not blame them. Trust, he was learning, was not a press release. It was a pattern of behavior repeated until the fear grew quiet. The keys felt heavy in Wesley's hand. He stood on the landing of the 3rd floor of 1847 Kensington Avenue watching Yolanda Jefferson turned the key in the lock of Unit 409. The door opened with a soft, clean click, the smell of fresh paint and new carpet spilling into the hallway. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, larger than her old one, the walls painted a warm, pale yellow that caught the afternoon light from the bedroom window. The kitchen had new linoleum, a refrigerator that didn't hum, and a stove that was clean and functional. In the living room sat a simple gray sofa, a kitchen table with 4 sturdy wooden chairs, and a small bookshelf in the corner. Xia walked in first, her bright pink school backpack still on her shoulders. She walked straight to the window, pressed her hand flat against the glass, and looked out at the playground. The swings have chains now, Mama, she said, her voice quiet. Yes, baby, Yolanda said, her voice trembling slightly as she stood in the center of the room. They're fixed. Darnell ran past them, his small boots thudding on the new carpet. He found the smaller bedroom, where a twin bed with a blue comforter and a bin of building blocks was waiting for him. He threw himself onto the bed, bounced once, then looked up at his mother with his thumb in his mouth. Are we staying here for real, Mama? Or do we have to go back to the church tomorrow? Yolanda knelt beside the bed, pulling him into her arms, her head buried in his hair. We're staying, Darnell. For real. This is our home now. Wesley stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his grandfather's watch ticking against his palm. He felt like an intruder in this moment of safety, a man who had purchased his way into a tragedy of his own making, trying to find a clean exit. Yolanda stood up and walked toward him, her face still, her eyes unblinking. It's a nice apartment, Mr. Foster, she said. Thank you. You don't need to thank me, Yolanda, he said. This is what you were owed. The bare minimum. Yes, she said, her voice dropping into that clear, honest tone that always made him feel small. It is the bare minimum. But in this world, sometimes the bare minimum is a miracle. She looked at the bookshelf in the corner. I start my new job at Temple University Hospital on Monday. Night shift. The on-site childcare program is confirmed. I'll pay my rent on time, Mr. Foster, just like I did for 5 years. I know you will, he said. He reached into his pocket, took out the pink hair clip he had found outside her old door and set it gently on the kitchen end table. I think this belongs to someone in this family, he said. Xia's eyes widened. She picked it up as if it were something precious pulled from a fire. For a second, the carefully guarded stillness in Yolanda's face broke, and Wesley saw the full cost of what his company had taken, not only a lease but the small, ordinary objects that make a life feel continuous. He turned and walked down the hall, the sound of his shoes on the linoleum echoing in the quiet building. As he reached the stairs, he heard the sound of a deadbolt clicking shut behind him. It was a solid, metallic sound, a finality that didn't feel like an ending. Felt like a beginning. The news segment on Channel 7 did not feature a billionaire savior. 6 months after the Open Door initiative began, the reporter stood on the same sidewalk outside 1847 Kensington Avenue. The snow was gone, replaced by the green of summer weed trees growing in the empty lots, the afternoon sun lighting the red brick of the building. The segment focused on the results. 214 families kept in their homes, 87 evictions prevented through mediation, a property company that had seen its tenant retention rate climb by 34% while its legal and turnover costs dropped by 41%. The camera cut to an interview with Yolanda Jefferson, wearing her blue nurse's scrubs, her LPN certificate displayed on the wall behind her in her new apartment. The system isn't broken, she told the reporter, her voice steady and clear. It's working exactly the way it was designed to work. It was designed to turn families into numbers and move them out when the numbers stopped performing. We don't need to fix the system. We need to redesign it. Later in the same segment, Odessa Harmon appeared on her stoop with a sweater over her shoulders and a look that dared the camera to sentimentalize her. He didn't save nobody, she said. He stopped breaking us. There's a difference. Don't clap for a man just because he finally did the job he should have been doing all along. Wesley sat at his long white oak table on Lakeshore Drive, his dinner plate clean, his wine glass untouched beside his hand. The television was on, the sound unmuted, Yolanda's voice filling the large, quiet room. He looked at his phone, then set it down. He didn't have any emails to answer. No zoning disputes, no occupancy reports, no corporate optimization files. The silence in the penthouse was still absolute, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like space, room for other voices to exist, room for a man to remember who he was before he learned to stop feeling. He walked to the window, looking out at Lake Michigan, black and endless under the summer stars. He had 14,000 doors with his name on the deed, and behind each one, A story was unfolding that he was finally ready to hear. On the glass table behind him, beside the untouched wine, sat his father's spiral notebook, no longer locked in a vault, no longer treated like scripture. On the last blank page, Wesley had written a new line in his own hand. A lease is a promise. So is a home. Keep both. In September, Wesley returned to Philadelphia one more time. Not for a camera. Not for a board update, and not because anyone asked him to. He returned because he had learned that accountability was not a single dramatic gesture. It was a habit. It was showing up after the applause had already moved on. He walked the halls of 1847 Kensington Avenue without a security escort. The stairwell smelled of laundry soap instead of damp plaster. A handwritten notice. On the lobby board listed office hours for the new tenant advocate, a free rent, clinic on Tuesdays, and a reminder that maintenance requests would be answered within 48 hours or escalated directly to regional ownership. On the third-floor landing, he paused outside Unit 409. Through the door he could hear the ordinary music of a life rebuilt. A television murmuring, a child laughing, water running in a sink. He did not knock. Some doors, he understood, now were not his to open. His job was to make sure they stayed closed when the people inside needed them to. Outside, the swings moved in the late afternoon wind. Xia's pink backpack was gone from the curb forever. Somewhere in the city, a woman in blue scrubs was clocking into a night shift with the quiet confidence of a person who finally had an address that would still be hers in the morning. Wesley stood on the sidewalk for a long minute and looked up at the building his company had once treated like an abstract number on a quarterly slide. Brick, windows, lives. He felt no triumph. What he felt was sharper and more useful than triumph. Responsibility without distance. He took out his phone and typed a short note to Derek. Expand open door to Atlanta next. Then Dallas. Same protocols. Same fund. Same rule. No family becomes a case number until a human being has looked them in the... Then he put the phone away, hailed a cab, and left Kensington Avenue behind. Not as a man escaping a scandal, but as a man finally learning how to carry the weight of 14,000 doors without pretending they were empty. Epilogue. A note from the author. I want to be completely honest with you before you close this video. Wesley Foster and Yolanda Jefferson are fictional characters. I made them up, the names, the conversations, the Calicut marble, the pink sticky notes. None of it happened exactly as I told it. But the crisis is real. The numbers I mentioned in this story are not fiction. According to the eviction lab at Princeton University, there are more than 3.6 million eviction filings in the United States every single year. That means every day, 10,000 families are threatened with losing their homes. Many of them are single mothers like Yolanda, people who work 40 hours a week and are one job loss or one medical bill away from the sidewalk. I wrote this story because I believe we have a responsibility to look at the systems we build and benefit from, to ask who is being erased so that our numbers can perform, and to remember that housing isn't just an asset class. Is the foundation of a human life. Behind every eviction filing is a kitchen table, a child's bed, a neighbor who will notice the silence, and a person who tried, often desperately, to keep a promise the system was never designed to hear. The tragedy is not only that families lose their homes. It is that companies, cities, and comfortable bystanders learn how not to see them. If the story made you uncomfortable, that was intentional. Discomfort is often the first honest response to a system we have been trained to accept as normal. If you or someone you know is facing eviction, there is help. Call 211 to connect with local housing resources, emergency rental assistance, and legal aid societies in your area. Many cities now have right to counsel, programs that guarantee tenants a free lawyer in housing court. You do not have to face the system alone. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it touched you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The more we talk about this, the harder it becomes to look away. And if you leave the story with only one sentence, let it be this: a home is not a line on a balance sheet. It is where a child sleeps without wondering whether tomorrow still has an address. Keep that sentence. Carry it into the rooms where decisions are made. Refuse the quiet convenience of looking away.